Welcome back to Two Nobodies, everyone. Rupesh is here. Just a programming note, as I mentioned in the last episode, this will probably be our last episode for the summer. I'm going to take a bit of a break, and then we'll be back in September full force. Probably our last guest for the summer, though, is somebody I'm really keen on talking to. This is a time right now in Canada where we are welcoming Pope Francis to Canada. He's come here for a reason. I want to give the date. Today is July 25th, and we're recording with Bob Watts today. I met Bob briefly when I studied at Queen's University when I was doing my Master's of Public Administration at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's, and I had seen him from afar, and I've always heard remarkable things about him. And so there's no one who I'd want to talk to, especially about Indigenous relations, about Indigenous policy, about the papal visit, than Bob Watts. Bob, thank you so much for joining Two Nobodies today. I was just telling you before we started recording that you're not actually the second nobody, but if you do me the honor, maybe you can be the second nobody today.
Yeah, Rupesh, I'm happy to be the second nobody. I'll be like your wingman or something, and we'll just have some fun this evening.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for joining us. It's we can start with the papal visit, but I kind of want to hear a little bit more about your story. I actually don't know really anything about you beyond reading your bio and hearing pieces from other people, but what a diverse and remarkable path you've had so far. I don't know where you'd want to start, but I guess where in the country were you born, and maybe start off a little bit there and sort of what brought you to this point.
Yeah, thanks. So I was born in Belleville, Ontario, a couple hours east of Toronto. Grew up at Tyne-the-Niagara Reserve, which is a Mohawk community right near Belleville. Lived there till I was in elementary school, and then my dad got a job in Cobourg. And I spent, the rest of my youth, elementary school, high school in Cobourg. Went off to college in Belleville. And just worked my way through a lot of different jobs. Ended up in Toronto working with the Indigenous community. After spending, I spent a short time over in Zaire, Africa. It was Zaire then. Now it's the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And just meeting the people there got me so interested in my own roots and my own family history. Spending time in the villages made me think about, this is the way that people were. They're so gentle, so kind, so open, so honest. I thought, this is probably like the story of my people in many ways, and really develop a deep desire to find out more about my own self. I just kind of grew up I'm Indian and First Nation now, Indigenous, Aboriginal, but it was Indian then, and really thinking nothing about that. That's just who I was. But then being, taking that time to reflect on that, and then getting involved with the Indigenous community in Toronto was such a blessing, such an eye-opener. The Native Canadian Centre in Toronto, I don't know, in some ways was a little bit of a spiritual birthplace for me and cultural birthplace, and caused me to, find a number of really good jobs and opportunities to try to contribute to my own community, whether it was working for Indigenous political organizations at the regional or national level, working as an assistant deputy minister federally. I got to work with Bob Rae when he was premier, helping to negotiate the Charlottetown Accord, which was really cool. Premier Rae was so great to work with. And then working with Phil Fontaine when he was national chief was one of the highlights of my whole career. I was his chief of staff and worked on negotiating the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Then I left the AFN to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and spent time meeting with survivors all over the country, church groups, about what a TRC would look like in Canada, because there's no template for a TRC. Yeah. So we made our own, and I think we did a good job considering the great work that the TRC has done. And later I was chief of staff to National Chief Perry Bellegarde. Got to work on a couple historic pieces of legislation on child welfare and Indigenous languages. Yeah. So I've been really blessed to have been able to work at really some important levels in terms of Indigenous and non-Indigenous government. To bring that experience to Queen's University was a real blessing. Teaching reconciliation and First Nation governance for about the last 12 years has been great. I think about that in terms of the journey that the students have been on, because every course is like a journey, and the foundation that people have now is way different than even 10 or 12 years ago, where there was still a lot of skepticism about residential schools and what really happened. And so it's been an interesting experience to see some of these evolution of thought and knowledge and sense of urgency on many issues really close up.
What a couple of things I want to pick up on there. First, just that sounds like it was a pivotal moment for you when you went to Africa, to Congo. What, like you said, you got to see some of their culture, but had that not happened, do you think that this path would have found itself towards you, or was there something there that really shook you, that said you had to get more connected to your culture?
I think I may eventually have got there. But I really think that experiencing that tribal life and that culture really accelerated everything for me in terms of both my desire to want to understand and my desire to contribute. I think I could have been like an armchair contributor because it was a good thing to do or the right thing to do or something. I'm not sure, but I think that accelerated my desire to contribute.
When you became an assistant deputy minister within the federal government, was that a common thing for an Indigenous person to have such a high place in leadership at that time, or was that somewhat of a unique role?
Yeah, there was a couple people that had achieved similar status before me, and then other people in elected positions and in the Senate, but within the bureaucracy itself, it was pretty unique, and I was pretty young, both to be an assistant deputy minister, and as you say, like being Indigenous was another sort of unique factor. I mean, I had people that ended up working for me one case for about a week because he didn't want to work for an Indigenous person, and he was a highly ranked federal public servant.
Interesting.
So, some of the attitudes really required a bit of a shake-up.
What was the concern? Like, without getting to the specifics, but what was the general sort of concern about it?
I think he was a person that was used to exerting authority and power over Indigenous people, and then having to report to one, I think really kind of upset his psychic apple cart or something, and he just couldn't take it. And it was one of the weirdest things. He came in and told me, he says, Bob, I was talking to my mom. He was over 20 years older than me. He said, I talked to my mom and I said, Mom, am I Indigenous? And she goes, no, fill in the blank for the name. You're not Indigenous. And he said, so I just figured that my best chance of moving up within the public servant service is not to work for you and go somewhere else, because I'm not Indigenous. And it was one of the weirdest exchanges. But people knew this guy too as being kind of a racist, a bit of a jerk. Actually, a couple of chiefs said to me, if you do nothing else when you go into that job but get rid of this one person, we'll consider it a success. And he left after the first week, not because I got rid of him, but because he didn't want to work for me.
Yeah. You also talked about attitudes just within, or perspectives or thoughts on how the evolution of the students that you've worked with over the past 10, 12 years has evolved. Tell me more about that.
So I think much like Canada, the students, the course I taught was about the future of Indigenous policy in light of reconciliation, that sort of theme. And so to set the foundation for reconciliation, it was to talk about residential schools. And many people started out sort of doubting residential schools, or perhaps the impact or the severity or the seriousness of residential schools. And it took quite a while. I would have survivors come into my class and talk about their experience. And then the students as a whole would come to a point of, yes, residential schools happened and it was serious. And then they would go to the next place, which would be a place of a bit of anger and frustration. Here I am at Queen's University in graduate studies and finding out about this for the first time. And why was this hidden from me? What about my parents? Why didn't they tell me? What about my pastor or my minister or my priest or my rabbi? Why didn't they tell me about this? Why didn't my undergrad profs tell me about this? Why am I finding out about it now? So that a bit of anger. And then they would go to a place of, we've got to do something about this. And some of them did. Some of them, I keep in touch with a lot of my students. Some of them have done great things. Some of them changed their mind, which is pretty good in and of itself. And so that journey is different for so many people. And then what I'm seeing now is some of those students, they have children who are finding out about residential school in elementary school, and maybe no more than their parents do, or finding out through the Downey Winjack Fund about that story of Cheney Winjack. And so things are changing. There's no question in my mind that things are changing for the positive.
It's interesting to think that, I went through that program, and that 10, 12 years ago, that graduate students had a hard time understanding the severity of the residential schools. That surprises me, but then it also, I just know from my own elementary school education or middle school education, there was nothing. I don't remember there being much, and if there was, maybe it was a blurb. I don't even think that it was. I know the feelings I went through when I first really learned and understood about this. But also, it's interesting though, if you're saying that sometimes people were still kind of, I don't know if it was denying it or maybe discounting the severity of it. That to me is still a bit surprising. I don't know how you're feeling, how you felt about that, but do you feel that within the public services itself, within the bureaucracy, that inroads have been made in terms of, obviously there's a lot of adoption of GBA Plus in that lens, and there's every public service across Canada, I imagine, has some sort of Indigenous framework, or and how to, and especially also introducing training and mandatory training for that matter for around the history of Indigenous peoples. Do you think it's making a difference?
I think it is. So much of the success of government depends on public servants really doing some excellent work. I mean, ministers can stand up and talk about, things that are important. Prime ministers can. But the public service is really the key. That's sort of the nuts and bolts of getting things done. And so I think those attitudinal changes that have happened, the federal public service really dedicating a lot of time and money to training, to trying to live up to those calls to action that were directed at them. And I've witnessed that. I've been part of training with a number of departments, and with folks that are kind of tangential to government, like the Bank of Canada and Canada Post. So you see a lot of crown corporations and other parts of government that are stepping up. And that's a lot of people. Just imagining if we could get sort of a sea change of attitude within the federal public service, and they all talk to their kids or their neighbor or somebody about this. That's some pretty profound change that's going on. And we might not see the payoff like right away, but we are seeing some payoff. There's no doubt in my mind.
Yeah, for sure. I just told my mom probably a week or so ago, because I had to take mandatory training through the municipality I work with, and I was just trying to. It was an interesting framing of how they talked about the residential schools, that I was able to tell my mom, who has no real understanding. I've talked to her about it before in the past, but it was just the way I was able to frame it to her really sat with her, and she was able to understand that. I was thinking about, though, she's been in Canada since the 70s, but I think about other newcomers who come to this country and are maybe not, who don't have an awareness about Canada's history and its history with Indigenous peoples. Do you think that there's work that's happening right now to help newcomers understand this, and how critical do you think that is in terms of, moving forward in reconciliation efforts?
Oh, I think it's so very important. We see changes happening with the oath, in terms of putting treaties into the oath. I don't know whether it's like an exam that people take about Canada, and there's Indigenous questions in there. Sometimes there's elders that are part of the swearing-in ceremony, which I think are all really great things. I know I've worked with a lot of different councils of new Canadians, Indo-Canadian associations, the Tamils, Chinese business associations, just a lot of different ones. And I think it's critical that they have that understanding. If I can just share two quick stories. I had a group of students come and approach me several years ago who had taken my course on reconciliation, and they said, can we buy you lunch? And I'm like, heck yeah, you can buy me lunch. And they were Muslim students. Yeah, they were Muslim students. And a lot of them were really active. They were, members of trade unions and really engaged. And they said that they wanted to do work on reconciliation. And they talked to some of the elders in their community and some of the people within the mosque. And people were saying, you know what, that's really between the Christians and Aboriginal people. Or it's between white people and Aboriginal people. That's not really for us. And so they said, what do you think about that? And I said, well, respectfully, I think that's wrong. I said, it seems to me that this minute that you touch your foot on Canadian soil, you're benefiting from the dispossession and the racist attitudes and the terrible effects of residential schools, of the Indian Act. All of these things have made many of our communities powerless and have hurt our communities in a profound way. And that even if you don't have a history of being part of that, that you're benefiting from that. And
Yeah.
and from my sort of simple equation is, if you're benefiting from that, then you should have a role in reconciliation. You should have a role in terms of making things right. You should have a role in terms of this reckoning that's going on, in terms of decolonization and ensuring Indigenous thought is brought to bear on so much of decision making in this country. That and to see some of the leadership that's come forth from new Canadians, I find it really heartening. I really do, because sometimes the old stock Canadians are the biggest deniers in terms of what's going on. And we have people here who come from other parts of the world. Some of them have really suffered, and
For sure,
and maybe
from
they're able to see
colonization or
suffering a
whatever
lot
their
easier.
history is.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great point. Well, how would you say relations with the federal government are these days with Indigenous peoples and the government?
This is a tough one. I mean, since Prime Minister Trudeau has been Prime Minister, we have seen historic financial allocations to deal with some of the toughest issues in this country, whether it's education or health and welfare, child welfare. These are historic, the funding allocations. Sometimes it's not experienced immediately in communities. So that sense of being stuck, or that sense of frustration, still exists in probably most communities in Canada. But and when I think about government putting money into education as an example, I mean, most governments want to put money into, we help construct this new bridge, or here's our sign, we're paving this road, or we're doing this big project, infrastructure stuff. But to put money into education, where you don't go and hang a sign on the school and say, the next generation brought to you by, no, you don't get a whole lot of accolades for that. And maybe the payoff is 10 years down the road, where the graduation rates have gone through the roof maybe, and people are confident they're going into university and college in huge numbers. So I think that's really brave, and I'm really grateful that government has taken steps in some of those directions where, it's not the big immediate payoff, and you get political payoff right away. Those are hard things to put money into.
Because the benefits are not realized right away, and these are system changes, right? And they take a long time, and so it would have been detrimental, would you say, if the government sort of focused on like the big shiny things, or like you said, in other forms of spending, it's always on these big capital or infrastructure projects that people see. Do you think that there maybe is a place for that, but in this situation, the steps that this government is taking is probably for the better, because it requires that courage. It makes those system changes.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our leaders say education got us into this mess. Education is going to get us out. So I think that's a big deal. We still have to deal with issues of unclean drinking water and moldy homes and lack of modern infrastructure in our community. So those things still need to go forward. But these other pieces that aren't so clearly visible also require attention. And then legislatively, we've seen some good changes too. We've seen C-15 go through, which was recognition of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. It's another one of those things where everybody's kind of jockeying around, like, what does this really mean? And is it a big constitutional change, or is it just, shining something up that was already there? And we're not sure. My own sense is that we're due for some big change. coming down the road because of C-15. And it'll take a while for us all to get comfortable with the notion of like free, prior, and informed consent, or Indigenous self-government, or the idea that this is part of decolonization and ensuring that Indigenous people are part of decision-making in Canada when it comes to how to use the fiscal framework and how to use legislation to advance the interests of everybody in Canada. How to make sure that 50% of First Nations children don't grow up in poverty. And we can do all these things. I think about one of the elders I was talking to about a year ago. He talked about COVID as a teacher. He says, what has COVID taught you? And I think it's a really good question. And like one of the things that's taught me is that we don't need to accept the status quo. We do not need to accept the status quo and those things. Well, there's cracks in society and people are going to fall through them, and there's disparities and there's rich. We don't need to accept that, because we've shown that when things are important, we can do it incredible, extraordinary things as a country. In terms of whether it was supporting businesses or supporting individuals, it was extraordinary.
How would you say the view is? And I'd imagine there's so many diverse opinions about this, but within, could you broadly describe or kind of give a feeler out about the community's views on how the government is responding, so making these big systemic changes, but is the view internally just not quick enough, too little, or do people understand what these changes really mean, and they will take time, but people are there, or people are patient? Are there generational differing views? Like, are younger Indigenous Canadians, are they less patient about change? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think generally there's a lot of frustration in terms of the pace of change and the types of change that we're seeing. And I think reconciliation is a double-edged sword. When government does something that is contrary to what Indigenous people are thinking they should do, then it's like, well, there you go. There goes reconciliation for you. And then when Indigenous people do something, then government or non-Indigenous people say, well, there you go. There's reconciliation for you. I mean, it's a tough road, reconciliation. So I think there's generally a frustration, and I think it's probably greater for youth. And the more that we've found out about the treatment of our elders through residential school or through Indian day school or through the child welfare system, then I think that compounds the frustration of the need to get things right and the need to have action to get past apologies or statements of sorrow, and let's get moving. And poverty is just such a huge issue. I mean, and when people are living that, it's hard to convince them that things are going to be okay down the road, because that's a grinding route.
Yeah. Is that, you mentioned poverty? I mean, are there certain issues that really stand out for you right now in terms of what needs to be worked on with Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I think it's a number of things all at the same time. So education clearly is part of that. I think we've seen some of the change from corporate Canada in terms of trying to work more closely with Indigenous people where it's possible, rather than kind of just riding roughshod over the rights of Indigenous people. So there's been changes there. But at the same time, I think, in a lot of places in Canada, Indigenous people see wealth, just going down the highway beside them. and whether it's mining or forestry or whatever that may be, and it's a legitimate question. Like, what about us? Like, that's our land. Why aren't we benefiting from that? What could we be doing different? How can we set up the fiscal framework differently so that provinces in particular step up and do resource revenue sharing with Indigenous people, to share some of that tax base with Indigenous people. So, we've got some way to go in those areas, because it's uneven playing ground, and you can see that when people have to go to, blockading trains or laying down in front of bulldozers to be able to get their point of view across. There's something wrong. Absolutely. With the sort of dialogue we're having as a country.
Yep. On the resources sharing, there seems to be this sort of ongoing, I don't know if it's tension, but we're seeing here in Alberta, there are First Nations who want to partner with the government, or at least, for example, in the Trans Mountain Pipeline, be a part of that project. But then there are also First Nations in other parts of the country, particularly in BC, who are opposing that particular project or the extraction of resources. I think about sort of broadly how non-Indigenous Canadians view that sort of, because I don't think people understand the diversity that there is between First Nations, right? And I think I wonder if non-Indigenous Canadians just view that as, well, there's disagreement there, and what does that really mean? And but it's interesting to see those discrepancies on some of these bigger issues, especially like resource sharing or resource extraction.
Yeah, I think it is too, and like to try to imagine with 634 First Nations in Canada that we would all think exactly the same about any particular thing is a fantasy, of course. Any more than how some of the provinces reacted to, Trans-Canada Pipeline and other interprovincial resource issues, where provinces disagree with each other and say, well, do whatever you want to do, Province X, because we're not going to approve it when it comes to our border. So that's part of that's part of life in Canada, is trying to sort through some of those really tough issues.
You said over 600. Would you say 634? Is that what you said? How many First Nations were there, Bob?
Yes.
Around there. How do you, as someone who, steered the Indian residential school settlement agreement, and then worked on the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where do you even start? I don't even know how you approach that. Let's start with the residential school agreement. That happened in, was it 2006? That happened around then? Yeah. Where do you start, Bob, when you're leading that?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I wasn't leading. I was part of a leadership group.
Okay.
But I think it starts with, like almost any really good enterprise, with a lot of really significant principles and values to help underscore change, so that you have those touchstones to rely upon when things get tough. And then and then I think this quest for justice is really significant. For us, it was identifying also some of the weaknesses in federal responses to residential schools, and taking apart, some of the work that they put out in terms of alternative dispute resolution, and just laying bare some of the real problems with the approach that they were taking, and I think trying to make sure that there was a system in place so that every survivor of residential schools could see some acknowledgement of the suffering that they had or their experience, and an ability to adjudicate some of those issues outside of a court, so that they weren't re-victimized. So putting those systems in place, and we were guided by residential school survivors. We were guided by elders in terms of the work that we were doing. You know, I think back on that settlement agreement. It was historic at that time. You know, I think if we would do it all again now, there might be some things that were different. But, you know, there was, I think, like 50 church entities that were part of that, and the federal government, and a few, you know, lawyers representing, I think there was 10 class actions that were going on at the same time. So it was a complicated and complex process. But again, I think it all starts with those values and principles, and the fact that we had ongoing guidance from survivors and from elders. You know, I'd be the first to admit that it wasn't a perfect agreement. But I think it was really good.
Was it true that that the preference was actually to bring it through the courts, and then the federal government at the times felt that by bringing it through the courts that it could essentially stall, not, or hold up the business of the court, or that it would, and so they wanted to move towards an agreement? Is there some truth to that?
Well, at that time, I think that there was some 10,000 court cases that were already going through the court system, and maybe it was 7 class actions that were making their way through, and it was really clear that to deal with that backlog, it would take decades, and that many people that started court cases may not have been around by the time their court case was actually going to be heard. So part of that idea is, like, how could we expedite this process and have one massive class action? And we did go through all those provinces where there were court cases and class actions to get sign off on the larger class action, to get that certification and that sign off from the courts. And I think that made it easier for government to do, that it wasn't sort of purely a political decision, that it was also a legal decision that was supported by a number of courts right across the country.
What does it mean for the attention that what does it mean for the attention that these cases got, or the history that Indigenous peoples experience as a result of the residential schools? What does it mean for that when it goes through a settlement agreement versus if it had gone through the court system?
That's hard to say. I mean, court systems are can be incredibly confrontational, and kind of like a winner and a loser situation. And what we tried to do is to ensure that everybody got recognition, even if you only attended residential school for one day. That there was recognition. And that if you were wanting to go through for settlement for sexual abuse or physical abuse, that there was arbitration system put in place that wasn't adversarial like the courts. So you could have elders with you, you could have your own support, and the idea was that it would be less confrontational. It would than a court. So that was some of the ideas that were part of that settlement agreement. One, that everybody that attended residential school and that was still alive got some compensation. And then for more serious cases, not having to go to the courts. Some people chose to anyway. And setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was part of the settlement agreement. A commemoration fund, so communities could do their own commemoration. So there was a lot of significant parts to that settlement agreement. I mean, it gave birth to the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, which was unique. It was the first TRC in a first world country, the very first one, and that's significant.
Yeah. What about the apology that Prime Minister Harper had given? I can't remember. Was it 2008 or 9?
8.
8. Was that? Did that come out of the? Was that something that the government of Canada did on its own volition, or was that something that came out of the settlement agreement at all? Or
no, it actually came out from. I think it was when Pope John Paul died. There was a delegation that went to his funeral, and Paul Martin was Prime Minister at the time, and he invited Phil Fontaine to travel with him as part of Canada's delegation. And when they were talking, Prime Minister said, National Chief, something like this, if there's one thing you want to accomplish while you're National Chief, what would it be? He says, I want to deal with residential schools. And the Prime Minister said, okay, we're going to do that. And then National Chief said, and I want an apology from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons for Canada's role in residential schools. And they shook hands on that. That was the deal. The Prime Minister and Phil Fontaine shaking hands. And to his credit, Stephen Harper honored that. Because by the time that rolled around, Paul Martin was no longer Prime Minister. And, you know, some of the ins and outs of the apology and who would be allowed in the House of Commons. I mean, the Indigenous delegations insisted that they be, like, on the floor of the House of Commons near the Prime Minister to receive the apology. And they were told, no, there's all these nice spots up in the gallery where you can sit. And they said, no, that's not good enough. And we want the right to respond. And they said, well, you're not an elected member. You don't have, like, a right of response. And then some of the leaders of the opposition parties, Stéphane Dion, Elizabeth May, stepped forward and said, you know, I'm willing to give up my right of response to the national leaders. And a number of MPs did. And then the Senate said, if you can't respond in the House of Commons, come over to the Senate. You can respond from here. And so there was a lot of pressure that was put on the Prime Minister's office. And to their credit, they accommodated that. And it was historic. The apology itself was historic. What the Indigenous leadership talked about was historic. Having the oldest residential school survivor in Canada as part of that delegation was historic. I mean, I was there. There wasn't a dry eye in the place, I'm sure. And there was thousands of people gathered on the lawn out in front of the Parliament buildings, big, huge screens that were broadcasting all of that. Libraries and schools right across the country watching it. It was historic.
Set me straight here, Bob. When we like you said, your students went through this process of, like, wow, there's this problem. I can understand that it's bad, to, like, feeling anger and shame about it, to saying, now I want to make a difference and have some solutions. We're at this point in time where here we are right now, looking back, thinking it took until 2008 for the government of Canada to issue an apology. As you said, it was historic, but a part of me still feels like, why did it take so long? I don't know if you can set me straight in saying, you know, it's like, I don't know, that's okay, or that's the course it was meant to run, and 2008 actually wasn't long ago? Or is there a part of you that feels like 2008, that apology should have been issued a long time ago?
That's a great question. I mean, part of me would say it's never too early to apologize for a wrongdoing, especially a terrible wrongdoing. And then I think about, what people would call kind of the black hats and the white hats within the Department of Justice, arguing over whether or not an apology is an admission of guilt and whether that, sets you up for more lawsuits, and these huge debates going on about that, and seeing other countries just kind of say, you know what, we don't care, we're going to apologize, like Australia. But like those arguments took place. Some of the churches had already apologized. Really profound apologies, much like what we heard today from Pope Francis. I mean, I think of the Anglican Church, the primate saying that we failed God. He said to survivors, and I don't know if I'm quoting this exactly right, but it's something like, we failed you, we failed ourselves, and we failed God. And I remember talking to the primate saying, wow, like to say we failed God, like that's a pretty big deal. He said, well, we did. There's no doubt about that. And he said, and we have to say that so that our congregations understand the seriousness of what we're talking about and why we're committed to reconciliation. So there's still that part. I mean, I think philosophically you might say, well, everything happens at its own time, and say, well, that was the right time. I don't know if that's true. I mean, even today, one of the things that you end up hearing is, oh my goodness, if only my dad could have heard this 10 years ago. He's gone now. Or my mom, or my grandma. And, to me, that just really speaks so much of it's never too early to give an apology. Phil Fontaine led a delegation to meet Pope Benedict in 2009. And why didn't we get an apology then? Why didn't we?
Yeah, why not a few years ago when Prime Minister Trudeau had asked Pope Francis for an apology, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I have a question before I get into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and more of your thoughts about the papal visit. I learned something recently, and I wanted to know if you have any, if this is true or not. But when the treaties were established, my understanding is that it was the women of the Indigenous community that actually that went as signatories to the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada then refused the women, and they said, go back and go get your men to sign off on this thing. But that the women essentially, as part of the treaty, they wanted to insert education into the treaties, and they thought that they knew that the importance of Indigenous children receiving education. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but then my understanding is that part of the driver for the government at that time, I guess the first government, was in order to fulfill the education requirement, they came up with the residential schools. Is there any truth to that?
I'm not sure. I mean, part of me would say absolutely. Our women leaders would have insisted on that. I don't know if that happened. I know that education's in a number of treaties, and education is a treaty right. But I don't know if it happened. That's so interesting. I got to go and research this, because it just sounds so really interesting. But I'm not sure. And
this part doesn't matter so much. It's like I think it's very clear on the intentions of the government of that day and subsequent governments perhaps after about what they wanted to do to Indigenous culture, and that's very, very evident. But I do, when I heard about this, I did wonder about if they didn't have the requirement to provide education as part of a treaty right, what would have happened? Like, would it have been any different? Like, would the structure and would this whole system have come out? And it just a part of me, my brain went that way. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, though.
I think that, for as long as there's been church representatives in what's now Canada, there's been some different attempts and different experiments with respect to education of Indigenous people. And it's been, those maybe three cornerstones that were part of residential schools, that idea of assimilation, civilization, and Christianization of children have been those themes in many different experiments in terms of how education could work. One of the things that gets talked about is before residential schools, there were industrial schools where, the job was assimilation, civilization, and Christianization, and sort of teaching boys maybe how to be farmers or how to be carpenters and some academics, and girls how to clean and cook and sew and garden, and some academic. And one of the things that got said, and this was the complaint from the churches, was that the wigwam was stronger than the classroom, which meant that all the good work being done during the day to assimilate, civilize, and Christianize children was being undone at night when they went home to their loving families, their parents and their siblings and their extended family. And the idea was that in order to really accomplish those three objectives, these children had to be separated from their families. So the idea of residential schools was born out of that need to separate, to get the children out of the influence of their families. Because as you know, one of the things that got talked about and was actually confirmed in Prime Minister Harper's apology, one of the objectives of residential schools was to kill the Indian and the child. Kill the Indian and the child. So that meant really having to remove children from the influence of their families and their communities.
That and what that did to just the fabric of Indigenous society, right? Of children being the center of Indigenous society, and like none of that was, well, maybe that was thought about, or maybe that was well understood, but we're certainly seeing the effects of that.
No question. And it really does show that, those children suffered incredibly. There's no question about that. But their parents did too, and their communities did too. Chief Bobby Joseph, he says that in his language, the word for child or children translates to something like our reason for being. So just imagine your reason for being is taken away. And he would say there was no longer any laughter in the communities because children represented that laughter. So people were harmed in every aspect of community.
Reason for being, absolutely. I feel that way about my 4.5-year-old daughter, and to think that
for sure.
Some of these kids were between 4 and 16, 4 years old, taken away. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we kind of talked about sort of the how do you start, where do you, and how do you start. But particularly within the 94 calls to action, there were a set of actions around the Catholic Church, and particularly around the Pope and having a papal apology. What was so critical about that?
Well, one, I think that the Catholic Church and the different orders within the Catholic Church ran the majority of residential schools. And I saw today they were talking about 60%. I've used the number 70% for a long time, so now I need to go back and do some homework and see which number was right. But a significant number of schools were run by Catholic orders, and then of course some of these papal bulls that ended up being, all parts of the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius were central to notions of imperialism and colonial supremacy, not just here in the Americas, but in many parts of the world. But I mean, what we're talking about is here, and how those notions of supremacy ended up manifesting themselves in terms of relationship between Indigenous people and colonial governments is part of the history of Canada. So it's no surprise that attention was paid to the Catholic Church because of so many schools that were run by them. And it's not like the other 40% or the other 30% were run by one entity. Some were Anglican, some were United Church, some were Presbyterian, some were Methodist, others as well.
Mm-hmm. Can I'm sure you have heard, maybe heard the apology or read the apology, but can I read a couple of excerpts here from the apology today? Would
sure,
that be
please.
Okay?
Yeah.
So, there was a lengthy apology, but there's some key paragraphs here that I want to read. It says, "I'm here because the first step of my penitential pilgrimage among you is that of again asking forgiveness, of telling you once more that I am deeply sorry for the ways in which regrettably many Christians supported the colonizing mentality of the powers that oppress the Indigenous peoples. I am sorry I ask forgiveness in particular for the ways in which many members of the church and of religious communities cooperated, not least through their indifference in projects of cultural destruction and forced assimilation promoted by the governments of that time, which culminated in the system of residential schools." It goes on. I imagine there's a lot of differing opinions and views on the Pope's visit and whether people want to pay attention to it or not, or just even the words from the apology. But for you, what does this mean?
For me, I start off with what it's called, this pilgrimage of penance, which I think is significant. A pilgrimage talks about like a sacred journey, and he's in our sacred territories, and I'm just struck with that idea of this sacred journey, and then that idea about penance, sort of that outward expression of sorrow for wrongdoing. And so this is that spiritual sacred journey about outwardly expressing shame for wrongdoing. So I think that's significant just all by itself. And I think those words that were spoken that you quoted are significant. Asking Indigenous people, the survivors, and their families for forgiveness. That takes a lot of humility to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And to think of one of the most powerful people in the world displaying that courage and humility, I find it's really striking. And I think about the Pope not just as the head of the Catholic Church, I think about him as an elder too. And he kind of displayed that he was an elder today. He was really hurting, physically being up there, but hurting spiritually too. So I for me, it was really significant. One, that he fulfilled this promise that he made 4 months ago that he was going to come here to our lands and to fulfill, the next step on this journey. And we'll see more during the week, I think. Because I think some people were saying, well, he might have touched on this or he might have touched on that. I think we'll hear more things this week from His Holiness, and going beyond just talking about bad individuals, but talking about the role of the church, I think is significant. One of the quotes he said, "It is in the face of this deplorable evil, the church kneels before God and implores His forgiveness for the sins of her children." Wow. That's really something. The church kneels before God and implores His forgiveness. And
I read that too, and I had the same reaction, Bob. Yeah.
And then he quotes Elie Wiesel, which I think is brilliant too. I've loved Wiesel for a long time, and so not shying away from some of those comparisons between our experience and the Holocaust. Like I think that like he didn't say they're the same or anything, but that profound impact on humanity, I think, is significant. Yeah. I
wanna just pivot a bit, and then if you're okay, I'd like to. I'm just checking. We're at about an hour here, and I want to ask, like we do with every guest, our final two questions. But there are a lot of there are many issues that we all are commonly having to tackle together, and the one I was on a focus obviously these days is something like climate change. And I actually read in your bio that there's a bit of an environmental side to you, and from a traditional aspect, and I'm curious about what the approach might be from. And again, you probably can't generalize this in any way, but what an Indigenous approach to climate change would look like, and would it be different from what most governments are trying to achieve these days when it comes to climate?
Yeah, I think it would be. I think it would start from most Indigenous perspectives with profound regard and love for Mother Earth, and that acknowledgement of how she takes care of us, and from a reciprocal point of view, how we need to take care of her. So I think it starts there. And I think, as my daughter Vanessa would say and did say in her dissertation, it also speaks about recognizing the agency of Mother Earth, that we need to listen for her voice and her desires and her cares and her thoughts in terms of how we make decisions. And I'd say that we have tools and thoughts like the two-row wampum, and like the dish with one spoon, which I really love. I was talking to an elder not that long ago, and we were talking about the dish with one spoon treaty. And I told him, I said, well, here's my understanding, and it was pretty superficial when I think about it. And he said, yeah, that's true. He said, but really it's a global economic model. And I said, well, that's a little bit different than what I was talking about. I said, tell me more, will you? And he goes, yeah, sure. He said, the dish, that's the whole earth. And the spoon represents the wise distribution of resources. But there's only one spoon. And he said, so we need to come together and figure out, how do we use that spoon? And who would be somebody that you would trust to be able to use that spoon to ensure the wise distribution of resources so that all of us have a chance, all of us are taken care of, and that spoon is being used in a way so that we ensure that there's resources and a quality of living for the next 7 generations. So we have to take into account our great-great-great-great-grandchildren as we make decisions. And then we need to recognize that the dish has agency. And so how do we take into account the Earth's agency in terms of a decision making? And so he just kept going like one circle out after another, and it was like, whoa, that's when you think about a model, and it's something we could do. I mean, there's nothing that would stop us from saying, figuring out something that's analogous to that spoon in terms of policy or legislation that would say, how are we going to wield this law, or how are we going to do this in a way that really ensures that we're all taken care of, and that we're doing things for the next 7 generations for all of our children in this land, and that we're taking into account the rights of the earth in terms of how we're doing this. I mean, we could do that now.
Yeah.
We could. And some people are doing it in a small way, but we need to do it in a global way.
Love it. Yeah, that's a interesting analogy that your friend gave you for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bob, are you okay if we pivot to our final 2 questions?
Yeah, sure.
So we asked this of all of our guests. Our first question is around 5 for dinner, dead or alive. Who are 5 people that you'd want to have a dinner with? And I don't know if you'd want them individually or together, but who would those 5 be?
Well, when I saw those questions, I said, this is going to be the most fun part of the interview. And then I thought, it's the hardest part of this podcast is figuring that out. So I would say, I want to have Sitting Bull at the table, and one of the most famous chiefs in North American history. So Sitting Bull, I think, has to be there. I'd like to have Nelson Mandela there, for sure. I'd like to have Abdul Baha there, who was a central figure in the Baha'i faith, and I'd like to have him there. And then I think I think we need some real beauty at the table, and I'm thinking somebody like Marilyn Monroe, because I think she'd have a lot of great stories, and
I'm sure she does.
and would bring elegance and beauty to the table, and then I want one of my own very personal family heroes, and that's my Granny Mel, and who would bring that. Even though she lived a pretty modest life, she treated everybody like they were royalty, and people always felt so good around her, and so I think having her at the table would be really great. That's I think that'd be a really good dinner crowd.
That'd be an amazing dinner conversation, and what a sweet person with your granny there. I might have the Marilyn Monroe one individually. That might be more fun. But my wife's gonna kill me for saying that. Last question. Beyond the circle of life, what do you know for sure?
One thing that I know for sure is that there's other worlds of experience that are out there. There's other spiritual worlds that we're all going to visit, and that the life that we're living here is preparing us for those other spiritual destinations, and we'll see our loved ones and our heroes, and probably like a really amazing rock band in on that journey. So I just know that for sure in my heart of hearts, and it's one of the reasons why maybe I take a little bit different view about death and dying. Like, I understand the seriousness of it, and and grieving and pain, but also have this underlying hope and faith in that as well.
Yeah. Would you say that you have do you still have a fear of dying, or do you feel like that's let go of?
Yeah, I don't think I have a fear of dying.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to die really miserably and
sure.
suffer for years.
Yeah.
But that's not a fear. That's just
Yeah.
If you're going to go later, let's go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was one of our guests said when I asked this question, but what do you know for sure? He said, if you let go of that fear of dying, you can pretty much do anything, right? Like
wow.
That's one of those
that's
things
beautiful.
that just I really like it. It just it's one of those things that holds us back in life, right? And I found that interesting. So there's some parallels with what you said, Bob. I really appreciate appreciated the conversation. It was an honor to get to know you. Well, a lot more is small with me saying that, because I never really got a chance to know you, but it was really great to getting to know you and to hearing your perspectives on a number of important aspects of the history of Indigenous peoples here in Canada, and on some big events that are happening and continue to happen this week with the papal visit. And I hope you enjoyed yourself as much as I enjoyed myself, and hopefully we can continue to talk in the future.
I hope so too. This has been so enjoyable. I can't believe how quickly the time's gone by, and I'd be really honored if I can take that handle as honorary nobody, and just put that on my mantle.
Absolutely, do it. That'd be a great blessing for us. So, thanks again, Bob, and we'll put all of Bob's information in our show notes and a link to his bio and such. And hope you all enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you back in the fall starting September. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.